Good afternoon and aloha. Thank you, David Lassner, for that great introduction. I really want to thank David Lassner for inviting me here, and especially for his incredible stewardship of our flagship university and for his understanding of tech in the context of Hawaii's future. I would be remiss if I didn't begin my remarks by acknowledging that the federal government is in the midst of the longest lapse in appropriations in our history. This diminishes our country, it hurts our workers, and tears us apart politically. We simply need to reopen the government. There are tech impacts too. As part of the shutdown, the FCC has stopped doing things like licensing and equipment approvals, which will limit our progress and imperil U.S. leadership for 5G. And the Commission has already asked to postpone oral arguments scheduled for next month on net neutrality. And so we need to end this nonsense, and we eventually will. But today, I want to focus on the ways in which the Senate and the Congress more generally have demonstrated a capacity for bipartisan action. In the past year, I've authored several bills that have become law in the tech space. The President has signed my legislation to give small businesses tools to firm up their cybersecurity infrastructure and fight online attacks. And the rationale behind this bill is very simple. The big companies have the staffing, both on the legal and the programming side, to protect against cyber attacks, but we found that the federal government could be most useful in helping small businesses to protect themselves. And the Main Street Cybersecurity Act, which was enacted last year, does just that. We were also able to enact a new law called the Open Government Data Act last week in the middle of the shutdown. And the basic premise is this, that the government is in the business of collecting lots of data, and every piece of data, weather, census, healthcare, traffic, whatever it may be, as long as it's not secret or private, that's the taxpayer's data. It is, in fact, your data. It should be machine readable and interoperable. And anyone who has either done a FOIA request or tried to access any of the executive agency's data understands that lots of times when you ask for it, at best they will give you a PDF. Sometimes they will not give it to you at all. And the basic idea is that this is your data. The app community loves this, the weather community loves this, academia loves this, people who respect the data collection process, people who like the government love this. Conservatives like it because they think they will be able to root out waste, fraud, and inefficiency by accessing all of the budget data, and that's why we were able to enact this into law. So, outside of the lines of partnership, we can still make policy. As the ranking member of the Senate Telecommunications Committee, I've been able to make good progress on things like 5G deployment. We introduced a somewhat controversial bill that shaped the FCC's guidelines on how to update our national 5G infrastructure. Before our bill, companies were essentially forced to navigate a maze of different state and especially local policies to deploy small cell applications. But now the FCC has created rules based on our legislation that creates a reasonable process and time frame guidelines for state and local consideration of small cell applications. So the state and local still have the control, but there is what we call commonly a shot clock on their decision-making process. Ultimately, this will make it easier to deploy the next generation of wireless technology. In addition to infrastructure siting issues, 5G is going to require more spectrum, and we have a constant need for more spectrum, whether it's for 5G or for Wi-Fi. So we have to find ways to maximize spectrum resources. I've introduced legislation that will help fund research on how to free up licensed spectrum so that we can make more available to innovators building new technologies. And the big caveat here, and I'll come back to this point in a moment, is that we really need to be thoughtful about how to do 5G deployment, especially not to reinforce the digital divide. This is clearly a policy issue from my standpoint because we do need incentives for companies to bring 5G to communities where it simply doesn't pencil out yet. But it's also a business issue. Companies can and should be thoughtful and innovative about how to bring 5G to more communities. We've also made tremendous progress in telehealth, and this is kind of my baby. I worked with Senator Orrin Hatch, recently retired. We actually had the biggest bipartisan health care bill in the Congress for 4 consecutive years, dozens of members on both sides of the Capitol and both sides of the aisle. And here's the thing about telehealth. Republicans tend to like it because it decreases the cost of the healthcare system. Democrats tend to like it because it increases the access and availability of care. But store and forward technology, where you take a picture and email it off to somebody to analyze the image, remote patient monitoring, where you will no longer have to drive an hour and a half to stick a device on your wrist and then drive an hour and a half back and then wait for the results, but rather that device could be on your wrist all along. And VTC technology, this is not, there was a time, David Lassner just mentioned my father, and he was a professor of medicine at the University of Hawaii. And my predecessor, Daniel K. Inouye, established funding for one of the first telehealth centers at the University of Hawaii. And it was a physical building. And there were efforts to make that happen. And that was the glimmer of hope that eventually this would be possible. But telehealth is no longer the future, it is now. The Department of Defense is using it, the VA is using it, Blue Cross Blue Shield and Kaiser are using it. And this is not because they want to have a little pilot program for innovation. It is because they are looking for ways to drive down cost and increase the availability of care. It's particularly important in the Pacific and Asia region for VA and for other agencies and nonprofits that try to provide excellent care but simply can't have physical infrastructure in far-flung islands. So telehealth really is the future. There's going to be a lot of money to be made, and there are a lot of lives to be saved. And I will not stop being evangelical about what we need to do in telehealth. Of course, we will need bandwidth, but I do not think that every piece of telehealth requires 5G deployment. Let's be clear. Sure, you want low latency if you're eventually going to do some of this really, really futuristic stuff. But dermatology, asthma, mental health services, all of those are things that just require a simple internet connection and transforming our healthcare reimbursement system to catch up with what the technology does, and transforming our medical education system to catch up with what is available to us. So this is not, listen, we're going to have to continue to advance the availability of high-speed bandwidth everywhere, whenever we can. But that's not the rate-limiting factor. It's actually about changing the systems of healthcare rather than just laying more cable and providing more bandwidth. So here's the thorniest issue for society as it relates to tech, in my view. Privacy. We've come to a tipping point in American society, if we aren't already there, where federal legislation is needed to regulate data collection and privacy. People have a basic expectation that the personal information that they provide to websites and apps will at best be protected, and at worst won't be used against them. And that expectation is not being met. Up until now, most of the debate around privacy has focused on something that they call notice and consent. And when I describe this to, say my kid, what is notice and consent? Well, it's the thing you click I agree on without reading before you access an app or a service or a website of some sort. And that's not a trivial part of the debate. That is a relevant part of this conversation. And we can make improvements to the notice and consent process in the same way that we did to credit card offers. At one point, not so long ago, 15 years ago, you could get a credit card offer and you couldn't sort them out, and you couldn't figure out what the interest rate was, whether it was variable, at what point they had the right to jack up your interest rates. And now there's a law that says in a minimum font size and in plain English, you get a piece of paper, and if you're reasonably well educated, you can understand what the deal that they're offering is. And so I don't want to diminish the importance of notice and consent, but just to say that's what happens before you click I agree. And 99.9% of people are going to click I agree, right? And so the real question is, what obligation legally should a company have for how it can use the online data that it collects from and about consumers? Think about the relationships that we have with other entities that control our private data. Your lawyer, your doctor, your financial advisor. They are all required by law to take care of what is essentially your information. and to not use that information against you. It's not that they're not allowed to possess it. It's not even that they're not allowed to share it under certain limited circumstances. It's just that they're required to be loyal to you. They have to be loyal to you. Online data should be no different. And so I, with 14 other United States senators, introduced a bill called the Data Care Act for online providers. And the basic idea is that a company, whether it's an ISP, someone who collects information about your credit score, a website, an app, a telecommunications company, would be required by law to put themselves in the shoes of the person whose online data they've collected and not use that data against them. Let me give you one example of not using data against them. If you Google leather shoes, right, and that gets fed into sort of some software that figures out, hey, this guy's looking for leather shoes, and then they serve you up some banner ads next time you go on some other website about leather shoes, they're not using your data against you, right? They're not using your data against you. So I don't mean to regulate all aspects of what is essentially a behavioral advertising business model for the internet. But if you Google skin cancer treatment, and then some company seems to see that you're going to and from a cancer treatment center, and then that company sells that data to a life insurance company to load it into your premiums, they're using the data against you. And the way we have this law written is intentionally a broad set of principles rather than specific statutory language. And let me explain why I think that's really important. We have to future-proof this legislation. We have to future-proof this legislation. What does that mean? It means that whatever you write, if it's too specific in the statutory language, then all, especially the big platforms and big companies will do is get their general counsel and all of their programmers to try to figure out a way around it. And so what you do, like what we did with the Telecommunications Act in the 80s and 90s, is you set broad principles and you allow the expert agency to interpret those broad principles. That will allow the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to keep up with whatever is next, whether it's the Internet of Things or AI or whatever it may be. You empower the expert agency and you let them make the rules. And it's really important that the United States lead here. If we don't lead or define privacy, then other countries will. And not everybody shares our view of what the right to privacy means. For some, privacy is a right that resides in the government, not in the people. In too many countries, that's the case today. And U.S. privacy law can make clear that privacy should not be shorthand for limiting freedom of information or freedom of speech. This can't get lost in the race to make advances in tech and telecommunications, because everybody, I mean, listen, on my subcommittee, everybody's talking about what other countries are doing with 5G deployment, and you become very interested in making sure that we're the first to market, and we've got more, and our download speeds and upload speeds are faster, and I'm all for all of that. But we have to do this based on our values. Because if we don't do this based on our core values, then we're going to keep repeating our mistakes. We have apps and products that make things easier in the short term, but don't really improve anything in the long run. Information flows at the speed of light through countries and continents. It doesn't have to clear customs and immigration. And the more global information flows, the more it shapes things like trade and education. And that's why this industry has to be based on shared values and principles. So I would like to offer you two of those principles. To start, we need to put people first and focus on solving real problems. It's fine if a company wants to build an app to make my sandwich deliver faster, but is that really where we're focusing the majority of our human capital, our intellectual capital, and our financial capital? And I've met with VCs in Silicon Valley, and I've talked to the Venture Capital Association, and they really do think about dumb processes and smart processes. And mostly they are talking about immediately satisfying human desires in a faster and less expensive way by eviscerating employment, right? That's the model. Everybody's trying to come up with the new Uber, the new Lyft, the new whatever it is. And it just strikes me that we're smarter than that we're better than that we've amassed between AI and actual human beings with big brains and more capital than has ever been assembled ever in human history, that we should be solving bigger problems than how quickly I can get my sandwich. We should be solving climate. We should be electrifying rural areas without warming the planet. We should be providing cheap and high-quality health care to as many people as possible. We should be revolutionizing education. And so I ask you to try to keep at least one eyeball on the big picture, because I am watching these titans of industry and all the people who are in Davos right now kind of thinking about solving the big problems in the evening, while their main job is getting me a sandwich faster. And I would like to invert that. I would like for the people who have capital, who are in tech, to think about solving the big problems first. Now I have to figure out where I was in my speech. Give me a second. So, more than 10 years ago, then Senator Barack Obama called the United States a land of moonshots and miracles of science and technology that have touched the lives of millions across the planet. Now, we're not alone in that, and the Pacific region is perhaps the best example of how companies and countries on a global scale are innovating and advancing. But his words remind us to consider what kind of legacy we are building on all levels, industry, regionally, and globally. And through smart and thoughtful policy and strong company and industry leadership, we can continue to be focused on moonshots and miracles that benefit the people in our community. I want to thank PTC for having me. I want to thank you for what you do for the Pacific region. I want to thank you for what you do for technology, and I appreciate you being here in Honolulu. Aloha, everyone.